Well, good morning. I'm David Sanger from the New York Times, and glad to see such a good-sized crowd here. And now everybody's had a moment to get a little bit caffeinated and all that, which is good because we're here to discuss nuclear Armageddon. So you always want to have a good coffee run at that moment. I am very happy to be moderating this panel with two people who I respect enormously, who have taught me an enormous amount on these subjects and who have become good friends over the years. Bill Perry here, former Secretary of Defense during the Clinton administration, worked in a variety of fascinating defense-related roles, and has just published, I just read this a few months ago, he was kind enough to send me, My Journey at the Nuclear Brink. It's outside. Don't miss it. It's full of fascinating stories, including the night that somebody woke Bill up at, 2 or 3 a.m., yeah, and from the Nuclear Command Center in Colorado Springs, I think, and said that there was a massive Soviet attack underway on the United States, and we had maybe 30 minutes to make a decision on responding. I won't ruin the surprise by telling you why it is that they woke up a senior official in the Defense Department absolutely convinced that we were going to be annihilated before sunrise. But it's an amazing story, and it will keep you up tonight. Outpost, A Diplomat at Work, is Chris's story of his amazing time in the State Department through the Dayton Accords, through his time as the envoy negotiating with the North Koreans, and then as Assistant Secretary of State for Asia. Boy, Chris, and I think about this, it's making me feel old, because how many of those stories was I writing when you were doing these years ago? But also should be read for a great anecdote, which is his motorcycle ride to take his Foreign Service exam. And the ride was through Cameroon. Yeah, right. I mean, like, who wouldn't take a motorcycle through Cameroon to take the Foreign Service exam, right? Before we do this, we have a question to be voted on. Can we throw that up on the screen? And of course, for those of you who are here this morning, you know this. You have a little vote clicker at your seat. The question is, should the U.S. strike at North Korea's nuclear facilities if it's determined that it has successfully weaponized a long-range missile capable of striking the continental United States? And so we're going to give you 10 seconds now to vote on this, and you'll vote again at the end of the conversation. You get yes or no. If your answer is uncertain, then you're lacking courage this morning. Okay. We'll see the results toward the end. So before we start this conversation, Bill has put together a fascinating short video. It's about 5 minutes, Bill, which we're going to play now and which will assure that you will skip lunch. So why don't we put that up?
Buried deep under these bone-dry high plains, in a covert section of a massively hardened centrifuge facility, a team is hard at work. They are members of a breakaway faction of the country's security forces, and they are busy enriching 40 kilograms of uranium. By July 3rd, they achieve their target of 90% enrichment, and then transfer the uranium to a nearby secret lab, where another team of technicians assembles it into a crude nuclear bomb. On August 31, they finish their work. They put the bomb in a packing crate labeled agricultural equipment and transport it to a nearby airfield where it is stored in a warehouse. 2 weeks later, it is removed and loaded onto an aircraft with civilian air cargo markings. it flies to Dubai, where the crate is transferred, along with other goods and equipment, to a global air transport freighter. Destination: Washington, D.C. The plane lands at Washington's Dulles International Airport at 2:47 a.m. on September the 15th. By late afternoon, the crate is delivered to a warehouse in the southeast part of the district. Then, before daybreak, on September the 17th, the bomb is removed from the crate and loaded onto a delivery truck. Several hours later, an American citizen eases the truck out into traffic. She drives it to a location on Pennsylvania Avenue, midway between the White House and the Capitol building. At 11:09 a.m., she stops in the middle of traffic, climbs down onto the street, and triggers the detonator. The bomb explodes with a power of 15 kilotons. There are more than 80,000 instant deaths, including the President, the Vice President, the Speaker of the House, and the 320 members of Congress present when the bomb goes off. There are also more than 100,000 seriously wounded, and virtually no place to treat them. Telecommunication facilities throughout the greater Washington area have gone down. Soon, cable news is broadcasting scenes of vast devastation from the Capitol. A short time later, all major news outlets report receiving an identical message. The message claims that 5 more bombs are hidden in 5 different cities across the country. It says one of these bombs will be set off each week for the next 5 weeks, unless all American troops based overseas are ordered to return immediately to the U.S. homeland. The nation is hurled into panic. Everything begins shutting down. Within a half hour, the stock market drops more than 70% before trading is halted. From coast to coast, masses of people begin to stream out of cities, no matter their size or location. There is widespread gridlock. Cell phone systems are soon overwhelmed, and calls cannot go through. Internet access is impossible in many regions, and the nation is now in a constitutional crisis. By succession, the Senate President pro tem is now the country's president, but he is being treated for pancreatic cancer far from the Capitol at the Mayo Clinic. The Secretary of Defense and the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, both of whom were testifying to the House Armed Services Committee on their recent budget request, are dead as well. Martial law is declared in Washington and surrounding regions, and the next day, the entire country. There is widespread looting and violence in many cities. Federal and National Guard troops are mustered. Soon there are reports of troops firing on crowds. There are increasing numbers of reports of rioting against immigrants and foreigners. Within days, the military begins to construct large detention centers around the country.
Like I said, we were out here to go suppress your appetites here for lunch. But the scenario that Bill has laid out here is not all that wild when you consider the number of loose nuclear weapons or weapons under poor control around the world. And so, Bill, let me start with this question to you. You frequently say that while the Cold War is over, you actually think that we face a greater nuclear peril now than we did at its depths. So tell me why.
Well, during the Cold War, we faced two perils, I think. One of them was the possibility of a nuclear war starting by miscalculation. And of course, the Cuba Missile Crisis is the primary example of that. And we now know that that was much more dangerous than we thought at the time. For example, we now know that while we were assessing correctly that the long-range missiles there did not have nuclear weapons at the time, what we did not know was they had tactical nuclear weapons with the field commander's authorization to use those. So had President Kennedy...
On Cuba,
in Cuba. Right. And had President Kennedy accepted the advice of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, we would have invaded Cuba, and those nuclear bombs would have been used against our invading troops, and a general nuclear war would undoubtedly have started from there. So it was a very dangerous time. That was a war by miscalculation that we missed. There also was a possibility of a war by accident. And you mentioned the false alarm that I received at 3 o'clock in the morning. We had 3 such false alarms that I'm aware of, and I'm also aware of 2 in Russia. Any one of those false alarms could have started a war. So the Cold War was a very dangerous time. Today,
Bill, do you want to ruin the surprise and tell them why you got that false alarm, or make them buy the book?
The false alarm, by the time the NORAD commander called me, he had already determined that there was something wrong. He didn't believe it. And he was calling me. At the time, I was the Undersecretary of Defense for Research and Engineering. He was calling me to determine what the hell had gone wrong with his computers. And we spent an hour on the telephone trying to figure that out. Turned out there wasn't anything wrong with his computers. What was wrong was the new sergeant, when he came on duty that night, mistakenly put in a training tape instead of the operating tape in the computer. And it was designed to look very realistic, of course. Well, humans do make mistakes. Machines err. And that still is true today. So we still face that prospect today. So those two things that challenged us during the Cold War, a war by miscalculation, a war by accident, we're still confronted with those possibilities, although I would say somewhat less likely than during the Cold War. But in addition to that, we now have the possibility of nuclear terrorism. You've just seen a video dramatizing what a nuclear terror attack could look like. And we also have the possibility of a regional nuclear war. Those are new. And you put all those together, I think the likelihood of one of those things happening is higher than the likelihood of a catastrophe during the Cold War.
So Chris, when you look at this video and you think back to 9/11, and then you think of your time dealing with the likes of North Korea, which now has somewhere between 8 and 12 nuclear weapons, even if they didn't have malevolent intent, you could imagine a situation in which North Korea was going through a collapse, a coup attempt, and some of those weapons went loose in the process. So how realistic, to your mind, is the scenario that Bill's laid out here in the video?
Oh, I think Bill's scenario is kind of optimistic on the whole.
By the way, I just want to note for you all that Chris used to have a lovely little house in Washington, D.C., and he's moved to Denver. So
First of all, I agree very much with the proposition that we live in even more fraught and dangerous times, notwithstanding these issues of being woken up with false alarms. There was much more command and control, I think, among a few nuclear weapon states who had nuclear weapons than one can imagine the command and control structures in a place like North Korea or, say, Pakistan. So I think what is especially worrisome is a proliferation to states that are, I don't want to use the term rogue states, but pretty close to it. And as for the potential, I mean, we have put the North Koreans on notice that if we find that they have proliferated fissile material, that will be a casus belli. We will go after them. Would we? Hard to say, because if you look at a map, North Korea is very close to a very close ally of ours. There are some 20 million South Koreans living within 50 miles of the border. And I think the tendency will be to try not to get into that kind of situation. And yet, I think we're getting to the point with the North Korean regime especially, where they have demonstrated, especially with Kim Jong-un, that they have really zero interest in a negotiating process. We tested the proposition that they were interested in negotiation. We worked very assiduously with other partners, especially the Chinese. It was very important that we engaged in negotiations because back in 2005, when we really launched this, the South Korean people, if you looked at polling data in South Korea, some 45% of the South Koreans were saying that the U.S. belligerence is the cause of North Korea's nuclear ambitions. I don't think anyone's saying that today because I think people understand we did try. But the issue before us is what are we going to do about this situation, because they show no interest in negotiation, and it's pretty clear that their testing program is just that, a testing program. They're not testing us, they're testing nuclear weapons. So I think we are coming up against a very tough time.
Well, Bill, that takes us right to the question that we asked everybody to go vote on. So probably a decade ago, you and Ash Carter, now our Secretary of Defense, famously wrote an op-ed at a moment that the North Koreans were getting ready. They had on the launch pad, getting ready to do a test of a long-range missile. It was so many tests ago, I can't remember exactly which year. And what was notable about the op-ed was that you took a pretty hard-line position. You said that if it looks like the North Koreans are getting ready to launch a missile that was intended ultimately to be able to reach the United States, that we ought to take it out on the launch pad before it got launched. We should conduct a preemptive strike. This was at a moment in history when preemption was more associated with the Bush administration and not really in that context. And yet you've said to me since that you think the moment for that is kind of past. So tell me what your thinking was at the time and why you think the moment is different today.
We had an opportunity during the Clinton administration to stop their nuclear program with an attack, namely by destroying their facilities at Yongbyon, which is where they do their nuclear development. We had a plan on my desk capable of doing that, and we considered it and put that plan on the back of the table in favor of diplomacy, which led to, as you know, the agreed framework as a way of curtailing their program. So that was an opportunity, and that opportunity doesn't exist today because they've already developed their nuclear bombs, and we don't know where the bombs are, as far as I know. So that opportunity is gone. In terms of their missiles, if we were to want to diminish their missile capability, and we thought that diplomacy could not do that, the best way to do it, I think, would be to attack the missiles in flight, not on the launch pad, over international waters. We could do that probably just as effectively, but we would do that at less risk than actually attacking them on their homeland. The problem with our attacking them on their homeland is it could very well lead to a North Korean strike at our ally in South Korea.
Wasn't that true 10 years ago as well?
It was true 10 years ago, yes. And so we had to weigh the various negative consequences. We were faced with a bad consequence and a terrible consequence. So even at that time, my own thinking was that the way to do it was through a strike of the missile in flight, not on the pad. But our op-ed, as you said, pointed out to destroy it on the pad, which is easy for people to understand.
Right. Chris, as we look back at the Obama administration, here you had a president who came in declaring, somewhat under Bill's advice, that we should begin to make it the objective of the United States to move to the complete elimination of nuclear weapons. The president often said, and said in some interviews I did with him and with colleagues, that this would probably not happen in his lifetime, but he wanted to move in that direction. First term made some progress. There was the New START agreement. Second term, that progress ended because the Russians stopped negotiating once Putin came in. But he did get the Iran deal. Tell us a little bit about whether or not you think the Iran deal was the right step in that direction. And secondly, whether our focus in Iran came at the price of, to some degree, ignoring the developments that Bill just described in North Korea.
Well, first of all, I think the Iran situation is very different from North Korea. Mm-hmm. I don't think that North Korea cares what any of us think. I mean, not even the New York Times, do they?
Really?
And so...
Are you suggesting they're not subscribers?
It's $7.50 a month, and that really could go to their nuclear program. So I think we have a country that is really kind of on its own. And I think this new leadership has made very clear they're not interested. That said, I think it's been important for us to thicken up our defenses there. And as you know, they're planning this to put in an anti-ballistic missile system. I mean, albeit it's kind of in its early stages of the full weight of the technology, and it will certainly cause problems with the Chinese, because the Chinese say it's really not against the North Korean threat. It's aimed at neutering our entire strategic posture. But I think it's, in diplomacy, one of those bad ideas whose time has come. I think we have to do that. I think we have to kind of work more with the Chinese on these issues. And I think we ought to keep the door open to the negotiations, but I don't think we should be paying for the same horse twice.
But the basic calculation the administration went through was Iran didn't have nuclear weapons yet. North Korea was already sort of in the rearview mirror. Is that?
Well, Iran has a 4,000-year history. It's a serious country. It's not necessarily run by serious people right now. There are internal divisions within Iran. I think the long-term prospect of Iran working out those internal events is there, and Iran could become a better place than it is now. And I think those long-term prospects are enhanced by an effort to negotiate with them. But I think when you look at diplomatic negotiations, you always have to answer the question, well, compared to what? And I think the sanctions program was pretty much of a depleting asset. We could see that sanctions were not impeding their their capacity to build sort of homemade centrifuges, and pretty successfully. So I think we essentially sold a depleting asset in the hopes that we could slow this down and give some of the internal processes within Iran a chance to work out, where many people in Iran, the engineering classes in places like, places like Tehran, as opposed to the mullah classes in places like Qom, could eventually prevail. Now, are we seeing any of that so far? No, we are not. Not at all. But we do have kind of a handle on the program. There are more people on the ground. There's a better understanding of where they are on things. And I think on the whole, compared to what the other options were, I think it was the right thing to do. And so the problem very much remains. It is very difficult once a country has started on this path to tell them not to, or tell them to dismantle. And in fact, the Ayatollah has made very clear they're not going to dismantle anything. But they have moved fissile material out of the country. And also, it has helped us to some degree to establish some patterns of cooperation with the Chinese and the Russians. And at the end of the day, if we don't have more regular patterns of cooperation with those countries, we are never going to get a handle on this nuclear issue.
Bill, a quarter century of coming in with a notebook in hand to go talk to you has taught me that you've never described a problem like the one you did in the video before without having 3, 5, 7 points about what it is we need to go do about it. So, so tell me, given the video, what's your plan?
The first thing that our government needs to do about it is already has started, which is the so-called Nuclear Security Summit, where they've had 4 different meetings, 2 in Washington, 2 overseas, among 50 nations, the nations that possess nuclear resources, not necessarily nuclear weapons, but nuclear facilities, primarily power reactors. Those are the places where a terrorist could actually get his hands on the fissile material needed to make a bomb. So these 4 summit meetings have the purpose of controlling access to that fissile material. And I think they've had a good degree of success in doing that. I applaud the administration for doing that. I think it's been a successful program. So that was an important step forward. But beyond that, the whole set of things we need to do involve believing, the government believing and the people believing that there is a serious problem. That's why what this video was intended to do is to alert people to the fact that this is a dangerous situation, which we don't appreciate in a democracy. For the governments to take action, which are sometimes costly and always inconvenient, they have to believe there's a serious problem that needs to be solved. So I think education is the single most important thing. That's what I'm devoting my own time to doing, for example, is providing it. The book is one example of that. But the book gets through to a small elite audience like sitting in the audience today. The key thing I'm focused on, and other people ought to be focused on as well, is getting a mass audience understanding the danger here. And that can only be done through the internet.
So a question to both of you, and then we'll go out to questions in the audience. So many people, when they look back at the Obama administration, they'll remember the Iran deal. They'll see the North Korea problem. I think many in the administration tell me that they are worried that this is one situation they may be leaving that's significantly worse than the way they found it. May not be their fault, but it's demonstrably worse for the reasons both of you have laid out. But the United States has also proceeded during the Obama years with a very major modernization program of our own nuclear capabilities. Partly this was the price the administration had to pay to get the New START treaty through. But partly it comes from the fact that our nuclear infrastructure was old. The difficulty is that as you modernize, you also increase the capabilities. So one of the proposed new weapons, for example, is an advanced cruise missile, nuclear cruise missile, that, Bill, you've separated yourself from the Obama administration from by arguing is a big mistake. So tell us what that would be, and then Chris, I'm going to ask you to sort of overall evaluate the modernization program.
I supported to begin with not going through a modernization at all. This was years ago, 4 or 5 years ago. But when Russia started their modernization program, I saw that was politically infeasible. So my second position would be, if as we modernize then, don't just replicate what we did in the Cold War, making a modern version of what we have for Cold War weapons, but think through what we need for deterrence and limit ourselves to that. I would support and do support the modernization of our submarine forces and the modernization of our strategic bomber forces. I do not support as you mentioned, the air-launched cruise missile, which is ironic since I was the one that developed the first air-launched cruise missile back in the late 70s. But most importantly, I do not support the modernization of our ICBM, our land-based missiles. The reason being is because the land-based missiles, by their very deployment systems, are targets. Yeah. And they invite attack. And if attack comes against the United States as that false alarm that you already have described to you, the president has to decide within minutes, whether to take that attack as a correct attack. He has to distinguish between whether it's a false alarm or real. If he concludes it's probably real, then he has to understand that it's probably aimed at our ground-based ICBMs, and they're going to be destroyed in the silos. And so his decision that he has to make in 7-8 minutes' time is whether to launch our ICBMs.
Or absorb that first attack.
Or absorb that first attack, right. And that's what forces this to be such a critical decision made in minutes, not in hours or days. So the fact we have ICBMs sets us up for susceptibility or false alarm, sets us up for launching a war which brings the end of the world by accident. And the only reason we have that danger is because we have ICBMs. And for that reason, I'm not in favor of continuing our ICBM program.
One thing that Donald Trump said during the campaign that turned out to be absolutely accurate, because it came right out of an Inspector General's report, is those ICBM fleets still use 8-inch floppy disks, which I bet many people in the audience here do not still have around in their homes. But it gets at the point that it's a vastly outdated system. So what you're saying is, rather than modernize it, it's probably also more susceptible to cyber attack, you would just basically close it down.
I would let the President's ICBM, Minuteman ICBM phase out, yes, and close it down.
Okay.
Not because I question the capability of the system, not because I question whether we could modernize it effectively, but because nothing in the modernization is going to reduce the vulnerability to false alarm and therefore the possibility of starting an accidental war. I don't want to be an alarmist about it. It's not a high probability. It maybe it's what, 1%, 0.5%, I can't put a number on it, but it's unnecessarily high. We don't need to do it.
Chris, this is also a little bit of an expensive program. If you look out over the nuclear modernization program out on a 20 or 25-year basis, and you include regenerating, as Bill has suggested, not only the ground force, but the submarine force and our bombers. Some of what we run a story recently about somebody who was flying the same bomber that his grandfather had flown at one point. It's about $1 trillion price tag over that number of years. So tell us what you think about the overall modernization program. Is it worth it? What parts of it would you do?
Well, I think you identified earlier there was some politics to it, to getting the agreement with the Russians through. But I think I think there is a substantive argument that we have some older systems, and there will be questions of reliability and, importantly, survivability. I guess what bothers me about this modernization program, we've just been discussing whether we really need this triad. One of our presidential candidates doesn't know what the triad is, but we know that it has something to do with it.
He's learned since. I
Did you
discovered
tell him
in
about it?
No, but in a subsequent interview, he seemed to have studied up on it. Yeah.
Okay. I hope he interviewed you on some of this as well. But so I think the issue is, what bothers me is, first of all, we retain this, we have never gone to a no first use policy, which given that it's all about the survivability of our systems, one would think that we could shift to a no first use policy, which I think would be helpful.
You want to just explain to everybody what the
Well, it's
theoretical
the concept that you will not use nuclear weapons unless someone else uses them against you. It's fairly simple. And when you only had a land-based fixed silos, it was kind of a luxury to say that, because your systems could all be taken out. And so that was the idea of having the flexibility that air-based and sea-based gave you as well, hence the triad. But I think since all of our force, I mean, especially the concentration on submarine sea-based, we probably are in much enhanced position of having a survivable force. Hence, we don't really need hence the idea that we can support a no first use, because we would be in a position to retaliate and essentially to annihilate our opponent, even if we're not the first one to use them. But I think the other thing that worries me about this huge modernization, as you say, $1 trillion, and as the old expression goes, $1 trillion here and $1 trillion there, and pretty soon you got real money. What are the Russians going to do? What are the Chinese going to do? I mean, these issues, these things don't happen in a vacuum. I mean, there will be a reaction, and we don't know what that reaction will be, and we certainly don't know what it will be in terms of the prospects of future arms control and things like that. I would like to emphasize, though, my point that no matter what type of, whether we go to a no first use posture, it will not help us with the North Koreans. I mean, this is in a different category, and I think we need to have a set of policies to deal with these essentially rogue producers of nuclear weapons. And I never thought I'd hear myself say this, but I think we are getting to the point where we do need to look at very seriously at those military options. We did back in 2007, 2008, get them to disable their equipment such that they couldn't bring it back in any kind of, say 5-year interval. Well, it's now been some 8 years, and they're back. I mean, they're producing fissile material now through the reprocessing plant, through the Yongbyon reactor. So they've got plutonium, new plutonium coming online. We don't know the extent of their highly enriched uranium program, but by all accounts, they are moving on that. We felt we had something going with Kim Jong-il, the father, because he at least cared what the Chinese thought about him. He understood this. But by the summer of 2008, we could see the winds kind of shift perceptively in North Korea, and Kim Jong-il, you recall, became Kim Jong very ill with his stroke, and so he was not in a position really to, if there was moderation there, it ended. So I don't think it's to blame the Obama administration, but I think there is a big question about where we go forward with North Korea. I consider it an extremely dangerous and really not that humorous a situation.
Chris was being modest. He actually negotiated that agreement in 07 and 08. Bill, on no first use?
I think we have a de facto no first use policy. We should take the credit for that and actually declare it.
Yeah.
I think politically there's very little chance that will happen now because the Russians, who did have a no first use policy all during the Cold War, have now abandoned their no first use policy. So politically, I think it's going to be very, very difficult to get a no first use policy. On the North Koreans, though, let me make another comment. On this infamous op-ed, which I wrote 10 years ago, I want to be very clear. Had I been the Secretary of Defense at the time, remember I wrote that op-ed as a civilian. Had I been the Secretary of Defense, I would not have recommended the President conducting that strike. I would have not. I did it because I thought it was important to try to concentrate the mind of the North Koreans on what our options were. And what was really in my mind is when I was Secretary of Defense back in 1994, when we had a crisis with North Koreans, we were having a difficult time getting their attention in discussions. My good friend Slocum.
Walt Slocum?
Pardon?
Walt Slocum? Mm-hmm.
No, I'm sorry. Francis Scowcroft. Scowcroft wrote a op-ed recommending we attack. And within 2 days after that, we began negotiations with the North Koreans. That's what led to the agreed framework. I believe then, and I still believe now, that focused their mind on what the options were and made them come to the negotiating table. I was hoping it might do that back 10 years ago. In fact, it did not. So whatever the objective was, it was not achieved.
Well, clearly the solution here is to get you and Brent Scowcroft to write an op-ed together. So why don't we bring up the lights and we will take some questions from you. There are microphones that are coming around, and once the lights come up and we can, there are people out there. Okay, so raise your hand and we'll send a mic your way in the back right there. Mm-hmm.
I'm supposed to tell you my name so I can be persecuted in the future by the State Department, Defense Department. It's Larry Litt. Eleanor and I have been Korea hands now since 1993. We know officials in South Korea. We've met many North Korean officials, and they all claim that their battle with South Korea is being interfered with by the United States. The threat to the United States is the threat to South Korea. The North Koreans are afraid that when the South Koreans decide to invade North Korea, the United States, as an ally, will help them to take over Diamond Mountain, which is the shaman mountain that Kim Jong-un, I know this sounds crazy, but it's true, that Diamond Mountain was the source and seat of power of the Kim family, of all the Kims, of the Im dynasty, of the way the three Koreas broke up. This is very important history, and they feel the United States has just completely ignored them as a nation, and historic. Their nation goes back 9,000 years. it's not exactly a pleasant place to be, North Korea, but certainly South Korea is. South Korea is New York. You go to Itaewon or any of the places in Seoul or in Daegu, and you see New York. The North Koreans would like to have that. They just don't want to pay fealty to the U.S. Eighth Army in South Korea. My question is there any way of gaining respect for North Korea rather than seeing them just as this focused enemy who's going to blow us off the face of the earth? Thank you.
Well, Chris, since you're a former ambassador and negotiator and all, let's give you the first shot at that one.
Yeah, I was the U.S. ambassador to South Korea, and later I came back to Washington, made the assistant secretary for Asia, and as a bonus, was double-hatted as the North Korea negotiator. When I was ambassador in South Korea, I was very worried that our relationship was drifting apart. I think, as I said earlier, many South Koreans were blaming the United States for North Korea's nuclear ambitions. We had failed to engage, and I think most seriously, we had people back in think tanks in Washington issuing blood-curdling statements about the North Koreans, and our South Korean allies were saying, that's easy for you to say, but we live right here, and we need a much more considered policy. The United States made a decision under George W. Bush to engage North Korea, to engage with everything we could, together with our Chinese and Japanese, Russian, and South Korean colleagues. I used to say at the time that it's the time when the South Koreans would stay at the airport and the U.S. would go off and talk to the North Koreans. That's over. We would do it together. South Korea is a full partner. I would assess that the U.S.-South Korean relationship is about as good as it's ever been. I'm very optimistic about that relationship. I don't think we have a better ally in the world than South Korea, but I think we have a very serious problem with the North Koreans. I think it's important that when the United States pronounces itself on some of these issues, that we try to make sure that our consultation with our South Korean allies is very full, and that the South Koreans don't think that we are just talking about some distant problem in the world, that we understand that that problem is right up alongside our great allies, the South Koreans. So I think we're in pretty good shape with the South Koreans, but the issue remains North Korea has zero interest right now in negotiation. I think they fear that a negotiating process would lead to a process that would eventually mean their demise, and their demise, I think they correctly understand, would mean South Korea is the successor state on the Korean Peninsula.
There was one other question here. You know where that is? Okay.
My facts may not be entirely correct, but it seems to me that we've made the same decision with Pakistan back in the 80s to try to buy them off in terms of having nuclear weapons. We gave them aircraft. Why do we continually make these same decisions all the time?
Bill, you were Secretary of Defense during the time that the Pakistanis were trying hard through AQ-Khan to develop their nuclear program, and of course ultimately they did a test in 98, right after the Indians had tested. Mm-hmm. Is there more we could have done to stop them? How would you answer this question?
Possibly, but I don't think so. We certainly thought about it. Our policy at the time, not only in the Clinton administration, but in the prior administrations, was to keep India and Pakistan from developing nuclear weapons, and we thought we had more leverage over Pakistan than we had over India. The leverage was the supply, the aid that we gave, particularly the military aid. And we had threatened to them that if they went ahead with the nuclear program, we would cut off that aid. Well, they did go ahead with the nuclear program, and we did cut off the aid. I'm not suggesting that was the best policy, but that was our policy. We failed. We tried hard, but failed in trying to keep Pakistan from developing a nuclear weapon. Perhaps it was inevitable. I don't know whether there's any different policy might have succeeded, but we surely tried.
We cut it off in 98 after the test,
yes,
and we resumed it on September 12th, 2001, when we needed them for getting into Afghanistan.
Yeah. I think sometimes the effort to sanction a country it makes a lot of sense. You kind of squeeze the country and they say, oh, no more, we'll stop doing the thing that you were upset at us for. But then some countries have the reaction that I think every single person in this room would have if someone tried to sanction you, which is to say, who the heck are you to sanction us? And hell or high water, we're going to go forward with that, the activity that you want us to stop. And so I think the whole idea of relying on sanctions as opposed to a very broad-based and deep relationship such that the country would evaluate its policies in terms of that broad-based and deep relationship, I think that's the way to go rather than sanctions policies. I mean, I don't object to, I believe we ought to throw the book at the North Koreans, felt that way for a long time. But I think we need to be careful about the notion that somehow we can deny them this or that and that they will then sort of cower in fear and give up. Because just as individuals would not want to do that, countries often don't want to do that.
And to support Chris's statement, the Pakistanis, after India tested, we were trying to prevail on them not to test. We were threatening sanctions, more deeper sanctions. And their famous phrase was, we're going ahead with this program. We'll eat grass if we have to. We'll eat grass if we have to.
Yeah, yeah.
So.
And their grass is not like Kent, Connecticut either. I mean,
You've addressed a lot of the state-sponsored issues that we're facing, but my understanding is that there's still a lot of nuclear weapons that, whether it's from the former Soviet Union or other situations, that major weapons are still not tracked, and that they may be with rogue members of different communities. So you've got that, and then a little bit of a tangent is we've got biological warfare, which is kind of the same thing. What would we do if we knew that somebody had that?
You want to take this?
Now, one can never say with certainty. I do not believe anybody has succeeded in getting nuclear weapons from either the American or the Russian stockpile.
Or the Chinese, or the Pakistani, right?
I think that also, but I don't know. I don't have the same kind of wealth of information I have about the U.S. and Russian.
She asked a very good question on biological, because the argument being made within your old building, the Pentagon, about why you would not necessarily want to sign on to no first use is supposing North Korea or another country used biological weapons against a U.S. ally, that you might want to have the option of using a tactical nuclear weapon to stop that. In other words, that might be one of the rare cases where you might want to do first use. Do you sign up to that?
I don't sign up to it. I understand the argument. I just don't sign up to it. When I was secretary, I think it was Libya was pursuing a chemical weapon program. And the United States demanded that they dismantle that factory. And the reporters, you might have been one of them, asked me at the time, what would we do if they didn't respond? And I said we would respond with overwhelming force. The next question was, would you use nuclear weapons? And the answer was we wouldn't need to.
You wouldn't need to.
Would not
would
need
not
to.
need
Not
Right.
need to. No.
And I think the point you're making is that our conventional weapons have gotten to be so speedy and so accurate that the number of cases in which you might need to reach for a nuclear weapon is probably less now than when you were secretary.
Right. So and for that reason, I still support no first use.
Right here.
Before this discussion, the audience was asked to vote yes or no on a very important, very focused question. May we know your answers individually?
You can know their answers, but you can only know it after you take a second vote. And since we are down to just a minute left, why don't we do that vote now, see what the audience thinks, and then we'll ask you both to comment on the results. So you've got 10 seconds. Again, the question is, should the U.S. strike at North Korea's nuclear facilities if it's determined that it has successfully weaponized a long-range missile capable of striking the continental United States? You have 10 seconds. Okay, so we can now see the results, both the before and after. Okay, so beforehand, we had 33% saying yes, and we now have 42% saying yes. Beforehand, we had 50% saying no, and we still have 50% saying no, and we have reduced the uncertains have almost all gone into the yes category. Bill, any thoughts on this?
Well, my answer would be no, but more qualified answer would be if I thought it would be effective, the answer would probably be yes. I just don't think it would be effective. And the downsides would be considerable.
Chris?
I mean, that's basically my view, except to say if we determine that they have a nuclear-tipped long-range weapon and they are then flying it, they are then testing it, and we determine that they have the ingredients for a long-range missile, and they fire off one, even one that they claim is non-nuclear, I would support shooting it down.
I'm in favor of that also, but not in favor of a strike against North Korea.
And are you both confident enough in our missile defense capability, remembering that we have an outpost in California and one in Alaska, and then, of course, floating ones on the Aegis systems, that this would be successful? Because there would be nothing worse than taking a shot at it and missing.
I have very low confidence in our missile defense system accomplishing the purpose for which it was designed, namely defending the United States against a determined missile attack. But that's a different question from firing at a test missile launched from North Korea, where we can have ships within miles from where they're launching them. In other words, we could go after that. That's an easy target,
And that's essentially the answer to give to the Chinese, who claim that what we're doing is trying to set up a shield against their deterrent force. And I think we are many years away from being able to defend against a massive nuclear strike.
Yeah, neither the Chinese nor the Russians have anything to worry about from a BMD system, sad to say.
Well, I thank you both very much. I want to remind everybody as they head out here, Bill's book is My Journey at the Nuclear Brink. It's got remarkable stories in it. Chris's is Outpost, a great memoir of diplomacy. I thank you both, and I thank you all for coming.